All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to this week's Wheatley Report. We're going to talk about the industry and potentially some ways that you can profit for it, or from it, I should say. Um, there's a bunch of interesting stories that are out this week, so I guess we'll go right into it. All right, so we like to talk about 5 themes and opportunities. The first is the widespread social acceptance. Really, it's hard to find anyone who's really against medicinal marijuana these days or legal cannabis. And I'll tell you a little funny story. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was visiting my grandmother in the old folks' home, and she's since passed away. But she was always a staunch Republican her entire life and very conservative. And I remember her telling me about how her good friend's grandson or granddaughter just went out somewhere like Oregon or Washington to become a marijuana farmer. And she was perfectly okay with it. So that was 7 years ago. So it's pretty amazing if you think that what's going to be routinely legal literally put people in jail for, decades. I mean, if you were some poor African American jazz musician back in the 50s or 40s, you got caught with marijuana, you were going to do some time. And even Gene Krupa did some time. But now we're looking at inevitably legal federally. And I think that's just going to happen. It could be next week, it could be in 5 years, but it's going to happen. People mostly think about the recreational cannabis markets, but I think the real big opportunities are going to be in the medicinal marijuana markets because this is really a biotech play. And marijuana has been shown to have some great medicinal properties that can do a much better job and replace many of the things that are being used today. And then, of course, there's the ancillary opportunities. Think about Levi Strauss, who sold jeans to the miners. Most miners in the gold rush, like 98% of them, didn't make any money because by the time they got there, the gold was all gone. But the first people that showed up became very rich. And then people like Levi Strauss, who had side businesses or ancillary businesses, made a lot of money as well. I mean, whether you were a bad miner or a good miner, you still needed jeans, just like you still needed shovels and so forth and so on. All right, so here's some things to talk about. There were some interesting stories this week. First is weakness in equities. Most of the things that we follow are either breaking support or testing support, and we'll see that in a few minutes when we get to the chart book. This caught me as a very interesting story. A lot of marijuana advocates say that it doesn't cause cancer, it's not bad for you, and so forth and so on. Well, in California, 20% of the pot that was tested failed to meet state standards. Now, most of this, 2/3 of this, were due to inaccurate claims on the labels. But more importantly, 20% were due to excessive pesticide residue. 6% was from microbial impurities, and 5% was due to wax buildup, which has pleasant things like ethanol and butane in it. So, you might be smoking marijuana, but you don't know what's on it. And I think this is actually going to help push the federalization, the legal federalization of it, because as the medical industry grows, there needs to be regulation. So I think that's going to help push it along. But, for all the people that are marijuana advocates, just consider that next time you imbibe. There was some news out of Oklahoma. Basically, they're becoming much more lax with the laws, cutting penalties for people that get caught. There was a study that came out of University of Georgia, I believe, and the National Academy of Sciences that said in states where there is legal cannabis use, there is a significant reduction in prescription opioid use. And now this, interestingly enough, was done on people that were, I believe, over 65. And the doctors that led the test argue that a lot of opioid addiction, things like heroin and Oxycontin, comes from people that get prescribed legal painkillers and then they get addicted to the legal painkillers. And when they can't get them anymore, they go to the illegal opioids. So what these doctors argue is that initially, if the medicine instead of opioids was marijuana, the people aren't going to form an addiction. So they won't have that desire or urge to go find some other pain medication when their prescription is done, and hopefully they're feeling better. All right, then a little story out of Kush Bottles, which I thought was kind of interesting. And, we certainly don't endorse this company. I don't know too much about it. But they launched Kush Energy, which is focused on supplying the industry with tested solvents and hydrocarbons and so forth. I mean, I don't even know what that stuff is or what it does to marijuana, but it just goes back to the points that I'm saying, is that there's a lot going on in this industry. So there's going to be a big demand for medical regulation, and then that is going to in my opinion, going to drive the legal federalization. All right, now talk about ancillary products. I guess if you're a drug dealer who likes to deal at work or keep very accurate records on your computer, this is a mouse that has a scale and a stash box. See, scale, stash box. So, I mean, when I saw this thing, I started laughing because it's pretty incredible to think that there's people actually, dealing out of their computers. But it's probably just more of a gimmick. I think if you're really dealing, you'd probably want to. I don't know. I don't know too much about dealing, but anyway, this is the idea of the ancillary industries, right? Now, who makes the parts for this? I looked it up, and it's a firm. The name of the division is ProScale, and it's by a firm called Accurate Technology. These guys are not public, but I think they used to make measuring devices, and then they got into scales, and now as there's a need for these scales because of this growth in the cannabis industry, I don't know if they're doing well or not, but this is just an example of things to look at. Scales, packaging. I think if their police are going to have some kind of a breathalyzer, who's going to make that? Who's going to make the components for that? So I think in the ancillary industries, the possibilities are almost endless. All right, so just to look at some of the markets now. In my method, we kind of talk about how there are certain price levels that are more significant than others with the amount of supply and demand that exists in them. Anyone who trades in the markets know that's true. In markets, prices are always doing one of three things. They're either going up, going down, or staying the same. And if you can recognize these trends and these levels, you can make money off it, and it can add alpha to your strategy. I don't use some of the esoteric things like Gann theory and Elliott waves. To me, that's like Bigfoot, UFOs, and the moon landing. Well, I guess the moon landing is true, but you know what I'm saying. It's fun to talk about it, but it's hardly credible. I have a lot of experience doing this, about 20 years. So when you're in the market every day for 20 years, you tend to come away with some things. At least I like to think so. And as you'll see, now that these equities are starting to develop histories, we can start to identify important support and demand levels and trends and so forth. All right, so we'll just take a look at these equities, their charts, and I pretty much just, this is not everything we follow. This is just things that I think there are interesting things going on that I want to point out to you. And like I said, we're seeing some weakness here. Most of these things are breaking support or testing support. So I would suspect that they're going to go a lot lower. All right, you can see here Apria, okay. Over the last couple weeks, this 1025 level was support, and it broke. So 1130 was resistance because it was support here. But I don't really see any support. Maybe down here, there's a little bit where this last low was, down around like 970, 960. But I don't see any significant support or meaningful support. So I think this thing could go lower. Aurora Cannabis, you can see that this 7 level was support here and here, but it broke here. And we talked about this, is that when something gets to an important resistance or support level and it's overbought or oversold, there tends to be a chance to make a trade because it's either going to revert or start a new trend. So here, oversold and gets to support, and sure enough, reverts. Here, oversold, gets to support, reverts. You can see here, I mean, I'm not pointing out any resistance levels, but when things become overbought or oversold, you should always pay attention. Now, when I got down to here, see, it spent like a week consolidating, so that took the oversoldness, so to speak, out of it, and now that's broken down as well. And again, I don't see any support, any meaningful support until we get significantly lower. Here's Kronos Group. You can see that this 550 level, as it's been support, it was support here, it was support here. That level is now being tested again. And again, this is not oversold, so there's a good chance that it's going to break. I mean, you can see back here, it even goes back to here. When it gets oversold, it tends to revert. But now we're kind of just slowly grinding away and taking the buyers out of it. The sellers are overcoming. All right, so Emerald Health, this is testing support at 2. You can see how 2 is support here. It was resistance here and support here. Now, we talked about this for a trade, and we actually made a little bit of a profit off of this. We bought it at 2 and sold it at 245, and we talked about that last week and the week before. And again, I was looking for a trade because it was oversold, right, and it hit support. And this is support psychologically as well. Anytime something goes from 3 to 2, it's going to bring out some of the bottom fishers. So, we were able to scalp a point after it broke the downtrend line. We bought it, sold it when it got close to our target, and now it's testing again. But now, like I said before, this is not oversold now. So it's could just kind of slowly work its way lower. So you can see what I mean. Most of these things that we're looking at here are showing bearish indications. This is GW Pharmaceutical. See, we looked for a trend. We looked for a trade here, but it never happened because we didn't break the downtrend line. This is off my screen now for a trade, but I just wanted to point out that it broke the trend, this downtrend that started here. If it rallies, I would suspect we're going to get some resistance around 140. There was support there, resistance here, resistance here. Okay, and this is the ETF, the Horizons Marijuana Life Sciences ETF. You can see this thing is just trending lower as well. Maybe there's a little bit of support here at 1145, but again, this could go a lot lower. There's really no well-defined support until down here, around 7 or 8. Innovative Industrial Properties. This thing's been flirting with the 3250 level. Got back above it, but you can see it's kind of trending and testing it again. So again, if this breaks, I don't see any meaningful support until down here, around 28. See, it traded up really fast here, so it really didn't spend too much time with people getting vested interest. So that's why if it kind of goes up really fast, it could kind of go down really fast. If it spent a long time going up, it would build a lot of vested interest. In other words, there would be much more supply and demand. So whichever way it was going to go, it's going to go much slower. When this thing just gaps up like this, there aren't too many people that sold it that said, all right, well, I'm going to buy it if it gets back to my price, which is the philosophical and theoretical reason why these levels form. Insys, this thing had some good news the other day. So I don't really follow the fundamentals on these biotech companies because it's pretty much impossible. But I don't know, if it goes back down, look for some support around the 650 level again. Was resistance here. All right, this is Kush Bottles that we mentioned before. With their push in energy. You can see how this 450 level was important. It was support there when it got oversold. Here. And again, once, it kind of slowly worked its way through. When it's here, it's oversold. It bounces back, oversold. But, now it gets to here and it's not oversold. So it finally starts to break through and go down. Scott's Miracle-Gro had an erratic trading or frenzy trading last week on their earnings. It's testing the support around 76.50, which was the low there and the low over the last week. This kind of, to me, illustrates some of the weaknesses with the markets that we have today. I mean, there's just no valid reason why something should be that volatile. But the reason is because there are no centralized markets now. We have, I believe, 13 public exchanges, about 40 dark pools, and all kinds of other alternative trading systems. So, I mean, literally, I've seen trades where you might want to sell something at 71, say, and then you see it trades at 71.10, and you say to yourself, well, why would someone pay 71.10 if I was willing to sell it at 71? And if you're a trader, that's the kind of thing you think about. But what's going on is that all these markets are not linked together. If there was one market where everyone traded, there would be so much liquidity that, you know, all the best bids and best offers will come together. But with this fragmentation of markets, that makes for extreme volatility. And the reason why these things aren't linked together is because they're competition. Like, for instance, if you're the Goldman Sachs dark pool and you have one of your clients trading in it, you wouldn't want to give them access to, say, the Morgan Stanley dark pool, because maybe Morgan Stanley can get business that is taken away from you. So you don't have the incentive. And I don't mean Goldman Sachs specifically. I'm just speaking in general, theoretical terms. So there is a motive for these exchanges to not, you know, trade with each other and give each other access. When I first became a trader, everyone used to complain about the specialists, who are the traders on the floor of the stock exchange. And these guys made a lot of money, but they provided a valuable function, and that's the centralization of trading. So, I mean, if you wanted to sell IBM in 1985, probably 98% of the shares that were traded on the floor of the New York. Yeah, you know, then you had some regional exchanges like Philadelphia and Boston, but for all intents and purposes, New York was the place to be. And because you had such a centralized market, you didn't have the extreme volatility that we have today. I mean, just a simple story could move, a simple story, something stupid out of China or something dumb with the trade wars or the fake news financial media making something up, could literally move the markets like 2 or 3%. And that's just trading. I mean, after World War II started, after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, in the week following that, that was on a Sunday, and the week following it, the Dow Jones was down a total of 3%. It sold off, I believe, down 7%, but it came back. So, all right, World War II starting, and the market moves as much as now some fictitious story that the idiots on CNBC are reporting can move the markets the same amount. So that's the trouble with these fragmented markets that come from all these dark pools and so forth. All right, weed, canopy growth, still working on around this 33.50 line or level. See if there's resistance here. But again, it's, you know, not oversold. This thing breaks. I don't see any support until we get down around here. All right, so if you're a day trader, you probably don't need to worry about this stuff. But if you're one of my institutional clients, this is the things I talk to you about. If you're going to take a position, is there liquidity? Are there other institutional investors involved? In other words, is there someone to buy it to or sell it from? I used to work for this PM who thought he was brilliant, but he wasn't. And I remember he used to come out of his office like, oh, let's buy 1 million shares of this. Let's buy 1 million shares of that. And I would look on the tape or do some research, and it was like, well, this thing only trades 1,000 shares a day, and it trades only 2 days out of the week. And there's no one to buy it from because there's no institutional holders in it. It's just retail people. So it's just, there's no way an institution could take a position like that. That's what's called liquidity risk. Maybe you could get in, but if you ever needed to get out, you wouldn't be able to. In the old days, they used to call that the Roach Motel. You can get in, but you can't get out. Are you going to be trading the ADR or on the primary exchange if it's Canadian? This depends on your exchange rate calculations, forecasts, some investment mandates. Like, for instance, some funds might only have the ability to invest domestically, which means they would have to use the ADR. PMs are going to need to think about having experienced traders trading this stuff, because outsourcing and junior trading models will just not work. Trading algorithms and trading outsource just don't work with these liquid things. And I would think that if you're trading these things in your fund and you get up to about $200 or $300 million, if you don't have a good trader, you're going to start having some real liquidity issues. And you should look at your trader, like me, for instance. as someone who's going to add value and be a profit center, because if you have an experienced trader, you're going to be able to handle more liquidity. PM should view a microcap or a small cap trader, or at least a good one, as a liquidity provider. If the trader knows where the positions are, in other words, it's a it's a hide and go seek game. If the trader knows where the orders are hiding and who's seeking and so forth, they're going to be able to get a lot more liquidity than just someone who mindlessly sits there and puts it in an algorithm and tries to beat the VWAP by a nanocent. You know, traded in Canadian, so Canada, so we got to think about the Canadian dollar exchange rate. And as we just discussed, there are some important support and resistance levels that are starting to develop. So we keep an eye on those. Just remember, all these support levels that are being taken out will probably become resistance. So there's going to be some overhead supply hanging there, which is going to be an impediment to these things moving up. All right. Thanks, everybody. That concludes this week. Well, actually, it doesn't conclude. I'm going to leave you with some interesting facts about cannabis. And this really was a surprise to me. The very first item ever sold on the internet was a bag of marijuana. The students at Stanford used ArapNet, which was the early form of the internet, to buy weed from their counterparts at MIT. Marijuana has been used medically since going back almost 4,000 years in China. And from 1850 to 1942, marijuana was actually very accepted in the United States as a medicine. So it's only, relatively recently that there's been this stigma against it. I mean, if this was 100 years ago in 1920, you could just walk into a grocery store and buy marijuana. The United States Declaration of Independence, written on hemp. And this was surprising to me. I guess I never really thought about it, but Paraguay is the world's largest producer of marijuana. All right, thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.